Welcome back to the Writers Craft Summit. In this session, I'm speaking with Lauren Sapala. Lauren, welcome to the summit.
Hi, Kevin. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, throughout the summit, we're going to have a couple different conversations zeroing in on different aspects of genre, or more specifically, different genres themselves. So today, you and I are going to talk about transgressive fiction, which is, I know, one of my favorite genres and the genre that you not only enjoy, but that you write in.
That's right.
Okay, so let's start things off first by saying, what is genre? As an author and writing instructor and coach yourself, what role does genre play in your creative process?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say there's a time and a place to consider genre. I get a lot of clients who haven't written anything yet, like they literally haven't even written the first chapter, and they're very concerned about genre. Well, am I going to write a mystery? Is this going to be a romance? You know, is this going to be a cozy mystery? If it's a mystery, like what am I writing in? And that is important to consider, but it's important to consider once the manuscript is finished, once the manuscript is revised, and once you're actually thinking about how is this book going to find its place in the world. That's when you want to start looking and say, well, what is it? Is it contemporary romance? You know, is it a cozy mystery like I thought it might be? Like, what is it? And then you use the genre to start sculpting your marketing. So that's really where I think genre needs to come in. Because if you are so hell-bent on it, like, well, I'm going to write a mystery and that's the way it's going to be, and you haven't even started, you've really boxed yourself in before you've even started writing. Because a lot of times it's unexpected. A lot of times, you know, and you're a writer yourself, your book takes twists and turns you never could have predicted. So I think when you really try to be rigid about it and say, no, this is a mystery. I don't know what this romance storyline is. Get out of here. It hurts the book. So I always tell my clients, let's consider genre when we get to the last stages of the process.
Fascinating. Okay, because that is the totally opposite approach of where I bring in genre. For me, I do start with like, okay, what type of story am I going to write? That's my starting place. So then for you, if you're thinking of that more in where is this going to fit in the market, who's going to like this book, where do you start then? And for you, is it just about digging into that creativity and just letting the story emerge?
Well, I should also say there are two different kinds of writers that I've run across. And in the writing world, they're usually known as plotters and pantsers.
Right.
And both approaches are totally A-okay. It really depends on the writer. Each writer has an approach that works for them. So if you are a plotter and you naturally are a plotter, I don't think you should try to force yourself to be a pantser. If you're a pantser, I don't think you should try to force yourself to be a plotter. But if you are one of those people where, like you said, you like to start from what kind of book do I want to write? It sounds like maybe you're more of a plotter. Like maybe
absolutely.
you want to work from the outline and you want to get the story arc nailed down and you want to know what the character's motivations are before you begin. So that really works well for you. So if someone is a plotter, they do probably want to bring it in at the beginning of the process. The pantsers, that's more of an intuitive approach. And that's where we get into, I've written the story, I've revised the story is what it's going to be. And now I'm going to think about who would like this book. Like, who does this book appeal to? So neither way is bad or wrong. They're just different ways of doing it. And I really do believe each writer comes to one way or the other naturally. It's like a temperament thing almost. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think anyone coming to this summit looking for the cookie cutter easy answer of like, here's how to be an incredible writer is going to be very disappointed, because almost every single conversation I have here, this is what we circle around to, is there is no right way. There is no easy answer. You need to find what works for you. And when you find what works for you, you find your voice and you're able to connect with an audience. And, you know, this beautiful creative thing emerges. And so I think all of these different craft discussions that I'm having are going to help people not necessarily learn something that they're then going to go apply, but rather see themselves in what's already out. They're going to go, oh yeah, that's how I do things. That's what works for me. Okay, so we're going to dig into transgressive fiction, which is what you write. So then let me ask you this timing thing then. At what point did you realize you were writing transgressive fiction in your books?
Well, it's funny. I was always really drawn to reading transgressive fiction. I didn't know that was the name for it.
Mm.
But, I'm 40 years old now. When I was in college, so about 20 years ago, I was really drawn to reading Jack Kerouac, William S. Burroughs, Jean Genet. And I knew these guys were writing edgy literature, literature that was dealing with sex and drugs and sort of these taboo subjects. But I didn't realize that there was a name for that, or that was a different genre. And so I was heavily influenced. I mean, Kerouac's like my favorite writer ever, as is Jean Genet. He's another one of my all-time favorite guys. So I was heavily influenced by them. And then when I started writing my memoir, it came out sort of in the same vein. So I wasn't really surprised during the writing process. I didn't try to make it be a certain way. I just wrote how I wrote. And then when I revised it and I started looking for agents, and I started reading, everyone reads those interviews like with agents, what are they looking for? And I just felt like, gosh, I can't send my manuscript to 95% of the people I'm seeing, they're like, I love a romance with a happy ending. And I'm like, I'm talking about, sewer rats being ripped open and their guts all over the street. Like, they're not going to like that, I found one guy who said he loved Cormac McCarthy, and he loved William S. Burroughs, but he said he was really looking for masculine fiction. And he realized that was a very male point of view, but that was what he wanted. So I felt like, gosh, I've been searching for like a needle in the haystack, and then I found the needle, and they're like, you can't have this needle. Like, you're not Cormac McCarthy. So I kept searching, and that's when I ran across the term transgressive fiction. When I was Googling, like, what am I writing? Literature with elements of drugs, alcoholism, mental illness, very like explicit sexual material, but not erotica, more like weird, hilarious, kind of messed up sexual material. Yeah, not steamy material at all. And that's when I found this term transgressive fiction. And I was like, well, hot dog, that's what I'm writing. And I never knew, And then in recent years, there's been a revival of it. And there's been a lot more people interested in it, which is a real change from the past decade, I think.
So you've hit on some topics that the genre covers. So these taboo subjects you mentioned, violence, drugs, and these sorts of things. What are some other elements of transgressive fiction that people might be able to identify?
Well, there's a couple different subsets of transgressive fiction. A lot of like noir fiction is transgressive fiction, or crime fiction could be transgressive fiction. The type that I'm really interested in is the Jean Genet type, where there's a spirituality that comes in, there's an examination of spirituality, but it's almost turned inside out. So in Jean Genet's books, I mean, in real life, he was a thief and a prostitute and a pimp at one point. Like, that was his life. And he wrote these books that were heavily autobiographical. And one of his books is The Thief's Journal. It's all about him being a thief. He breaks into people's houses and he steals their stuff. And his epiphany, in a normal book, you would have this protagonist that does that and then has this big epiphany of like, and then I realized it was wrong. And that's when I realized I wanted to go to the good side. And that's how I found my connection to spirit. Jean Genet completely turns that inside out. He's like, oh, as I'm stealing stuff from people, I realize this is the closest I've ever felt to God. This is great. I'm going to keep doing it. This is my life purpose. I am a thief. I'm going to really embrace that. And same thing with Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac had these experiences where he would go to San Francisco and live in the Skid Row hotels with the alcoholic bums. And instead of, again, hitting the wall and saying, and then I realized I had to get sober, he's like, no, this is great. This is when I found my true connection with God, was with these destitute people and really being at the bottom of the world. He's like, the only way to reach enlightenment is to look up through the bottom of the world. So that's the subset that I'm really interested in, is turning that spirituality issue inside out and looking at ugly things, seeing the beauty in the ugly things, seeing the value in the really hilarious, messed up things that you should be disapproving of, but it's just so funny that you have to love it. Chuck Palahniuk does that a little bit too. He's a little bit more like on the hilarious side of transgressive, though. He's
Yeah, I
probably
think
one of the best well-known people too.
yeah, but as his career has developed, it's definitely gone like more and more into the kind of the funny, over the top, almost parody type stuff, right? It's
Yeah.
interesting. But I think that's one of the fascinating things about transgressive fiction is, you know, if you say, "Oh, this book is about violence and drugs and sex or outsiders, criminals, people rejected by society," it all sounds so dark, and yet often there's some hilarious elements in all of these books. It's a black humor in the darkness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that's what I found with my memoir. Between the Shadow and Low, it's about my years as an alcoholic. There's a lot of really dark stuff in there. There's a lot of really hilarious episodes too. And it's like sort of like 10-year-old boy humor, but hopefully with beautiful prose thrown in. But like I talk about like having an attack of diarrhea from, drinking too much, or like getting your period in a strange one night stand's bed. It's like, oh, well, it's kind of gross, but it's kind of funny, and readers have told me like, I laughed hilariously, but I was cringing the entire time. So that cringe, like laughing place is right where I want readers to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think clearly there's a rebellious nature to transgressive fiction. We're not just writing about outsiders, but these outsiders are actually like pushing against the center, right? Like there's almost a political nature to this work in that we're kind of rejecting the mainstream.
Oh, definitely. I think especially in today's world where so many people are afraid to even ask questions, because you can say something and then it's like goes viral on social media and you're totally shamed for actually asking an honest question. Like, well, is it this way? Or is it okay to be this way? And then all of these strangers jump in and say, no, and like, that's totally wrong, and you should be ashamed of yourself. So I think transgressive fiction authors are really the voices who are saying, we need to ask questions. We need to be honest. Sometimes you have thoughts and feelings that are not going to be approved by everyone. That's human life. Sometimes you have opinions that are controversial. That's human life, and we have to keep doing that. We don't want to live in a society where everybody's filtered, or everyone's sort of filtering themselves because they're living in fear that like, well, someone's going to put this on Twitter and then I'm going to be shamed forever and blackballed. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting the way I was thinking about how transgressive art is pushing against the mainstream, but like you're saying with like social media stuff now, it's like I don't even know, like everything is the mainstream now. It's like it's weird the way like what would have been a counterculture conversation completely divorced from the mainstream 10-15 years ago is now pulled into it through the public nature of social media.
Yeah, well, and you see it all the time where you'll hear like, well, a celebrity said this and their movie deal was dropped, like no one will talk to them, everyone has blacklisted them. And then when you actually go back and look at the interview, you're like, I don't think it was that bad. Or like, I see what they were saying. I think it was sort of taken out of context, but then you don't want to speak up because then there's already people who are going to villainize you for saying, well, should we slow down and reevaluate what the person said? And beyond that, even if their opinion is offensive, aren't they allowed to have it? I think they are. Even if it's like that opinion totally sucks, they're still allowed to have it. Freedom of the individual. And I think that's where transgressive fiction really comes in, is like, this stuff's going to push you. It's going to provoke you. It's going to make you uncomfortable. But we're allowed to do it.
That's exactly why I wanted to have this discussion as part of this summit, because I think fiction provides this really special outlet for reactionary or political or let's just say transgressive, right? Transgressive art, because the money required to make television or cinema, you know, those sorts of outsider messages are almost always compromised, right? Like it just costs too much money to make a film that's only going to apply to a niche group, or just like you were talking about, the censorship in society, right? And then if you're going to do like really transgressive theater or painted artwork or whatever, you're going to have to forget a gallery, and it's kind of there's not really an opportunity for like a mass appeal. But with literature, you can write these totally outsider stories and then throw them on Amazon, and anyone can get them and read them. And, you know, we're even seeing censorship on platforms like Amazon and stuff now. But I think it's like books are the last bastion of like free speech and of a place where you can get away with being crazy or an outsider or saying things that not everyone is going to agree with.
Well, yeah, and that's the flip side of social media, especially with transgressive fiction. So there's a great website that I'm actually a part of called transgressivefiction.info. And it's just a band of transgressive fiction writers who got together. This guy launched a site. We're all on it. If you go on Twitter and you use the hashtag transgressive fiction, all of our stuff comes up. A bunch of material comes up. And it's one of those things where it's like, the hashtag isn't that frequently used, so you can find some real gems by using that hashtag on social media, because no one owns that hashtag. No one can control it. You know, no one can say, no, you can't put that website up, or you can't use that hashtag. So there is this never before seen level of freedom too. With, like you said, with literature, you can self-publish and put it on Amazon, which is what I did, and people will find it. If you use the right keywords, people will find it.
You went through, having read your memoir, fictionalized memoir, I know you've been through some very challenging times in your life. When I was a teenager, I was a punk rock kid living in a small country hick town. So, you know, that created its own challenges. Do you think people like ourselves who have maybe been outsiders or who have faced violence or challenges in their lives are drawn to transgressive fiction more so than maybe someone who's lived a more mainstream life?
Oh, yes. Well, I think too, if you've had the experience of a traumatic childhood or extreme challenges in your life, it kind of works hand in hand with being a highly creative person. If you were creative before, it's like it pushes you to become more creative. If you come out on the other side of that, and as a whole human being, where you're like, yeah, I took those experiences, I went through them, and I've learned from them, and you've really up-leveled, you have become this really highly creative person. You're able to be resourceful, and you're able to see the solutions other people can't. And as a highly creative person, you're going to be drawn to transgressive fiction. You're going to be drawn to anything outside of the mainstream, because the mainstream is just not going to interest you anymore. I work in an office right now in a corporate company, and so many of the people I work with, they're like robots. Like, they follow this life plan of like, well, I got straight A's in high school, I went to a good college, and now I'm in my marketing job. But then when I really talk to them, like, you know, I get them alone, they're not happy, and they're searching, and they don't know what they're even searching for. And I think that people who have really gone through stuff in their life, they actually tend to be happier. They're like happier, more creative, more willing to be like, yeah, I want to live life to the fullest. I want to get involved in art and music and literature. I want to see what other people are doing, because that's where it's at. So I think that it's like a blessing in disguise. I know everybody says that, like, well, if you go through hard stuff, it makes you a better person. But in my case, at least, it really was such a gift that I had those experiences.
Yeah, I mean, you have a nice arc to yours where it feels like things came out good on the other end. I feel like I was kind of like broken down by my life, and now I'm like a broken person. But like, for me, it's not like I was made better by the experiences, but I do feel like those broken parts of me are the parts that allow me to create art for some reason. And so I don't think I was made stronger by the bad things that happened to me, but I do feel like the bad experiences are the source of my art, and I don't know why that is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I don't even know, there's no conclusion to that sentence, really. It's just interesting that,
Well, that's where the story is. Right? I mean, every story you look at, there has to be bad shit. You know what I mean? If you look at the ancient Greek myths, or you look at the modern day soap operas, there has to be conflict. There has to be something that challenges the characters and puts them in an impossible situation so they can grow. And that happens in real life too. You get challenged and put in these impossible situations so you can grow. at the time when you're in it, you're like, yeah, that's great. I'm growing. This is so fun. I'm so glad I'm growing. Like, it just sucks, but later, usually you can look back and get the perspective of like, oh, and I needed to do that, and I had to meet that person, and it all had to happen like that. It's, in my opinion, it's story. Like, we all live out a narrative.
I think that's one of the things that attracts me to transgressive fiction, as well as to horror and some of these other like more histrionic forms of narrative. For some reason, that feels more real to me. Like, that feels more like my experience of life than a more realistic rom-com or something like that. That just doesn't feel like anything I've lived when I watch a rom-com or read that. But when I read, more Bret Easton Ellis or something, like, something in that feels like more real to me, even though it's heightened and exaggerated and sometimes comedic and all of that. There's a realism there.
Well, yeah, that's a very good point. It actually brought to mind, I don't know if you've ever read Stephen King's It, with the clown.
Oh,
Pennywise the clown. Yeah, that's actually, it's horror, but it's a really good example of transgressive fiction as well. There's a lot of scenes in there with kids. The main kids are like 11 years old. And there's a lot of scenes that have been censored out of the movies. Some sexual stuff happens between the kids, and they did not put that in the movie. And there's a lot of controversy over those scenes at the end. But I read that book when I was 12, and it spoke to me because I knew what those kids were going through. They had abusive parents who did not see them. Their sexuality was waking up, bullies at school who were extremely violent. And when I read that, I was like, Stephen King really knows what it's like to be 11. Being 11 is no picnic. It can be really, really hard. And I think a lot of times as an adult, you don't want to see that or think about things like that. Like, oh, how hard really is it? But transgressive fiction sort of rips off the varnish. And it's like, yeah, it can get really, really brutal at being human, no matter what age you are.
That makes me think of, I'm reading a book right now to one of my daughters. I think it's called Not One Damsel in Distress. And it's a collection of folk tales and whatnot about women warriors. And they're filled with violence and all this excitement and stuff that she and I love. But it makes me think back to your comment earlier when you were looking for an agent and the agent said, oh, I'm only looking for a male perspective. I think a lot of the stuff we see in transgressive fiction is thought of as kind of things men are interested in. Can you talk about what it's like being a female author working in that genre?
Well, for me, it's interesting because I've always felt pretty androgynous. Like, physically, I present very female. I've got long hair. I wear makeup. I'm very feminine. But inside, I've always felt somewhere in the middle between male and female. And all of the authors that I connect with, pretty much all of them, are male. Jack Kerouac, Jean Genet, William S. Burroughs, like, those guys, I feel like they get me and I get them, even though we've never met. And in my fiction work, all of my protagonists are male. And I don't plan it that way. They just come to me and they're male. So I've always had a very special connection with men. So I never felt marginalized. Like, when I found that agent and he wanted I was really bummed, and I was like, that sucks. But I wasn't mad at him. I wasn't resentful. Like, and he's sexist. He's a chauvinist pig. I was like, yeah, that's just the way it goes. I get it. That's what he's looking for. Now it's really worked in my favor because as transgressive fiction it's experiencing this revival. And at the same time, there's a huge upsurge in feminism and awareness of women's voices. So I'm able to sort of be like, hey, I'm a woman transgressive fiction writer, The interesting thing is that there's not very many of us. I have met a lot of, I'd say actually, like, not a lot, but a few women on social media who are writing transgressive fiction, but haven't put anything out because they're so afraid of what family or friends might think of them. I had one woman email me and she said, I have all these manuscripts in a drawer, and I'm terrified that my friends and family will think I'm writing my twisted fantasies, and that's hard to deal with as a woman, especially if you're a mother. You're like, because I've had other people say, like, well, I'm writing this stuff, but I have toddlers and they're going to grow up one day and they're going to read this stuff and their mom wrote it. And I have a 4-year-old son myself. So I'm like, I get that. But it's harder. I think it's harder a lot of times for women to come out and say, I'm writing transgressive fiction. especially if they don't even know there's a name for it. They're not the only one. This actually is a respected genre. It has a tradition and a history. It's not that they're just writing their twisted fantasies. Because when you start writing, and you're writing transgressive fiction and you don't know that's what you're writing, it can be it can be a little unnerving.
I've seen this with my clients who I've been working with writers, and they're like, I had one client who was basing some stuff on his parents' divorce, and he was saying to me, you know, I'm really nervous about working these experiences into the writing, and what are people going to think about my parents or think about me? And I had just read these chapters he just sent to me, and I am the child of divorced parents. That had a huge impact on my childhood. And so I was like, dude, when I was reading those chapters, I wasn't thinking about your parents. I was thinking about my parents.
Yeah.
And so that's something I really encourage writers to keep in mind, is that the readers aren't thinking about you. They aren't judging you. They are trying to see themselves in your experiences. They want to know there's someone else out there as weird as they are, as broken as they are, as messed up as they are, right? And so, you know, if anyone's watching this and they feel like an outsider, or they feel broken, or they feel like they just like art with lots of blood and guts or something, you know, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Do your work, create your art, and there's going to be other people who are I mean, there's always going to be people who are going to judge you for your art. That just always happens. But there's going to be this other group of people who are going to see themselves in your writing, and those are going to be your readers, and that's who you're making this art for.
Exactly. And you know what I found, which I always tell my clients, before you publish, you think, I'm going to put this out here, and all my friends and family, they're all going to have a big reaction to it, and they're going to really disapprove. And then you put it out there and it's like crickets. And then you realize, like, no one's even read it. Like, no one really cares. And that almost hurts more. You're like,
absolutely.
Come on, I was expecting this big reaction. You know, I mean, at this point in my life, I'm like, it's fine. My friends and family don't really care about my work, and that's okay. But I think that's the thing that a lot of newly published writers have to get over first, is like, oh, you've been sort of obsessing about it, and like, no one even really cares that much, you know?
Absolutely.
Which is kind of a wicked burn all of its own.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it's funny. I think a lot of writers, one of their biggest concerns is criticism, is haters, is people saying it's terrible, when exactly as you just said, the reality is 99% of people aren't going to care at all, and that's so much worse. So I say, you want haters, you want people giving you bad reviews, because that means at least someone's reading and caring, and you're having a reaction on someone. And if someone absolutely hates your work, that's a very good sign. There's probably someone else out there who's going to think it's the best thing they've ever read.
Exactly. And you'll get the flip side. You'll get like completely random people that you've never heard of. Like some guy in Germany will email you and be like, I've read your book 5 times. When is the next one coming out? And you're like, who are you, sir? But that's really great. Like, people will reach out and say, your book changed my life. Your book really moved me. It's just random strangers. It's not like you're going to suddenly heal your relationship with your parents by putting your book out. You know?
Well, I'm so glad you came on this summit. We got to talk about this, because I feel this dichotomy in myself sometimes, where on the coach side of my business, I'm really trying to find ways that people can be happy and productive and creative. And it's all about positivity and about finding the best in people and in everything. But in my art, I just want to like mess shit up and tear things down. Right? Like, as an artist, I'm not about building better things. I believe there's things in society that I disagree with, and I want to tear it down through my art. And so I'm so thrilled to get the opportunity to have this conversation with you about the type of art that I'm interested in, which isn't always pretty. It isn't always about making things beautiful and better. Sometimes it's about making things better by tearing things down and blowing things up.
Exactly. Well, and that's really part of the artist archetype. Artists create, but artists destroy. Artists are the one that come in and build a big bonfire and throw everything into it. They're like, that's it. Everything's going, and we'll start with something new. And that's something that a lot of people are afraid to do in society. A lot of other people are not on that wavelength. They don't want to destroy things, but sometimes things need to be destroyed. It's messy, but it needs to happen.
Lauren, thank you so much for taking time to come on the summit and have this conversation with me. I loved it, and I know there's people out there who are going to really resonate with the sorts of things we talked about today.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for having me. I had a good time.